Chapter 1. What begins, what ends. Dusk. The old quarter of a city where river meets sea. A man in a dark gray overcoat walks the quarter's streets, a tangle of cobblestone passages that spin from the harbor and thread themselves through neighborhoods where the smells of cooking spices vary, but the sad decrepitude is shared. The buildings, black with the soot of centuries, loom over him, blocking out most of the sky and making it difficult to know at any given moment whether he is heading toward the water or away from it. The man suspects this is a city in which even lifelong residents find themselves lost. He does not know whether he is such a person, though. He does not know whether he's ever been here before. He does not know why he's... As the sky darkens, the buildings appear to list precariously. In the oily luminescence of the occasional streetlights, new-looking and polished to a high gleam incongruous with their surroundings, they cast shadows at odd, seemingly random angles that suggest that light behaves differently here. This is a city of ancient and flawed geometries. A steady drizzle falls. The man in the overcoat passes people taking cover under awnings and overhangs, plodding forward with heads down and hats low, huddling under rags and alleyways. Though this is a city of watchful eyes, gazes wash over him and roll away. This is a man who does not attract attention. He turns a corner. A wide-hipped woman stands outside her home, a narrow brick building, 4 stories tall and covered with a black layer of lichen, and she hangs a sign offering rooms. She is the wife of a sea captain who left 4 years ago on a ship bound for a remote island where the hills are said to be bursting with silver, the valleys teeming with exotic fruits and game. His return is 8 months overdue, and the bank account is empty. So she has begun taking in and feeding poxy and gnat-gnawed sailors, in addition to her 3 ravenous sons who are all dreaming of following their father and shipping out into the unknown. None of them yet knows that her husband's bones are lying under a mile of water, some beneath a stack of cracked timbers just off Cape Fortuna, a place they have never heard of, and some scattered for miles by pelagic scavengers. This is what happens, of course. Men get lost, men vanish, men are erased and reborn. The woman steps back, eyes the sign, tries to determine whether it hangs true. She tips it back and forth, dissatisfied, and she wonders whether perhaps it is the building that is crooked or the city itself. She has heard whispers that it is sinking. Regardless of the cause, she will not abide by a crooked sign. Why, that man in the overcoat plodding her way might be looking for a room. And if she wants a higher class of lodger, she must give a good impression. And she tips the sign one way, then the other, then back again. The man walks past. She glances up just in time to see one dripping gray coattail disappearing around a curve in the street. He will never cross the threshold into her home. She sighs and turns her thoughts to the pot of miserably thin brown soup bubbling in the kitchen, and how she can make it last for an entire week. Why is the man in the overcoat wet? Perhaps he has been walking in the rain for hours, or perhaps he has been wading through a maze of half-submerged tunnels that underlie the twisted city. Perhaps some anonymous onlooker fished him out from the waters beneath the wobbly bridge that spans the river, connecting the old quarter and the new. Perhaps he simply crawled up out of the brackish river like some amphibian ancestor from the old Red Age. A mystery to himself, he has only 3 connections to an earlier life. One is in his coat pocket, a sludge of ink-stained paper on which he believes something important was once written, though all he can make out clearly is an ornate S-shaped symbol. Another is in his trouser pocket, a tiny black orb that might be a pebble or maybe a piece of ancient and petrified fruit. The third runs through every cell in his body, a vague but terrifying sense memory of falling from a great height. But falling from where? And into what? And why? He pauses at the edge of a puddle, and perhaps this is a trick of the light, or trick of the shadows, or a trick of this tilted city, but for a curious moment, the light reflecting on the surface shapes itself into an image of a woman's face. And then, just as quickly, the image is gone, and the puddle is simply a puddle again, with a few streaks of light and a rainbow sheen greasing its surface. "Flowers," a voice called from an alleyway. Flowers going out of business. He turns another corner. Onto a still narrower street, where a malnourished cat laps eagerly at a pedal, pausing to arch and hiss at the man in the overcoat passes close. Several hundred yards ahead, a recent immigrant who speaks the language only haltingly enters a storefront to return a rented barrel organ. The owner, who wears a yellowed undershirt with a greasy stain on the belly, rises from the desk at which he has been sawing at a grayish sausage on a plate, takes the organ from the immigrant, and leans it against the wall with the 18 other organs that he has rented each morning to other just as recent and just as tone-deaf immigrants. He holds his palm out for his half of the organ grinder's take. The organ grinder does not yet understand the local currency, so he hands his cigar box of coins to the owner and asks him via hand gestures and sentence fragments to do the stacking and splitting for him. The owner makes 2 piles. He pushes the taller stack across the table to the organ grinder. The shorter stack, which is worth much more, this apparently being a city of ancient and flawed arithmetics as well, he sweeps into an open drawer. The organ grinder, who understood when he rented the organ that this unscrupulous man would cheat him at any opportunity, has anticipated such a trick and has stashed away a portion of the day's take. Those coins, wrapped inside a handkerchief, are snug in the pocket of the tattered red coat worn by his capuchin monkey. The monkey sits grimly at the end of a thin rope that is knotted through the organ grinder's belt loop, giving away nothing. The owner, of course, suspects that the organ grinder has done this. It's not a new trick to him. Once the immigrant leaves the shop, the owner will direct his slow-witted but strong-armed sons to follow the man through the night, as long as it takes, until he gives himself away. Perhaps when he ducks into an alleyway beside a tavern and empties the monkey's pockets, at which the sons will hold him down in the street and crush his wrist bones to dust with lead pipes. They will catch the fleeing monkey by its rope and try to sell the beast inside the tavern. No one will want it, of course, so they will try again and again at the increasingly disreputable watering holes closer to the harbor. Eventually, the brothers, now quite drunk, will go out to the docks, tie something heavy to the other end of the rope, and test how well monkeys can swim. Yet none of this will happen for hours. Right now, as the owner slams the door shut and the organ grinder pockets his meager take, the man in the dark overcoat passes outside. The men do not notice him, but the monkey, sprawled in the doorway, bares its teeth and hisses. The owner and the organ grinder part with a handshake that both conceals and codifies their mutual distrust. And the man in the dark overcoat disappears around another corner, leaving these two to their commerce of song, coin, and bone, with his soles squishing softly on the stone, and the sky darkening into true night. And then another corner, and then another, and the man in the overcoat finds himself on an unlit street. From far ahead come a few sharp percussive sounds, stone on stone it sounds like, but here, around him, the street is deserted. Quiet but for the rain's soft patter, so quiet that he imagines he can hear the whispering voices of people who have met their ends in this place where river meets sea, in the city and in the maze of tunnels running just below its streets, in the former trading post village buried beneath the maze, in the catacombs below that, and in the mud hut settlement buried still deeper, in all the strata of civilizations. The sounds come to him in a sonic Mobius of whispers. The words are indistinct, but the tones of rage and lament, of burden and cataclysm, of dissent and vengeance, and grief, are as sharp as blades. He wonders now if he should be feeling fear rather than the numbness of body and mind that has dampened his senses since he awoke. From what, a dream? A fugue state? A borrowed life? And began wandering the quarter. He tries to listen more closely to the voices, but the rain drives harder against the street, drowning them in the wash of sound. And then the plaques of stone against stone come up again, 9 sharp reports, and 3 groups of 3, and his feet carry him around another corner, onto a well-lit stretch of road. 3 boys who have begun hurling chunks of brick at the glowing glass domes tuck themselves into an alley when the man in the overcoat comes into the view. Struggling to stifle the giddy laughter of transgression, they wait for him to pass. None of the three bothers to look at his face, for who is he to them? He is an adult, and thus merely a faceless representative of order and judgment. He is the conch from a policeman's cudgel. He is the blow that awaits them at home. He is the end of all possible thrills, and thus he is to be avoided. Beyond that, he is not to be taken seriously. He is to be scoffed at and then forgotten. The sodden man passes them, his head cocked as if he is listening for something. The fool. And they wait as he shuffles. As his shadow passes over the brick-fronted buildings, they wait, and finally he's gone. They dart back into the street, take aim, and sling rocks at one of the city's new streetlights. The very first blow finds its mark, sending a cascade of broken glass and sparkling magnesium down to the street. The boys laugh and scurry off. White smoke rises from the wet street. As the man in the coat approaches the harbor, one of the city's voices reemerges, intoning one phrase over the fading rustle of whispers. What begins at the water shall end there, and what ends there shall once more begin. What begins at the water shall end there, and what ends there shall once more begin. What begins at the water. The harbor master is on the docks, looking through his spyglass, and through the murk and rain, at a dark shape in the distance, just inside the mouth of the harbor. All of those ships cleared to anchor or berth are already accounted for, and no more vessels are scheduled to arrive tonight or tomorrow or even the next day. Not until the behemoth liner Imperia departs. The shape on the water looks vaguely ship-like, but unwieldy and strange. It is either heeling steeply in the wind-sheltered bay, or it is the product of inept craftsmanship, afloat only by the means of Neptune's fickle grace. He lowers his spyglass and shrugs, concluding that the dark shape must be a cloud formation, maybe some optical trick of troubled air conjured by the strengthening storm as it tumbled itself off the sea and into the harbor. Time to get himself home to a fire, a hot meal, a dry bed, and the tick-ticking of his mother's knitting needles in the tidy home they share on the riverside of the quarter. He turns up his collar, hunches his shoulders against the rain, and begins his walk along the darkened streets. The shattered glass of the streetlight globes crunching under his shoes. He grits his teeth in irritation. Such times are these. He nods a greeting to a drowned-looking man in a dark overcoat and a Homburg. The man ignores him and sloshes past, which angers him further. Whatever happened to comradeship, to incivility? The friendly hello, the small talk of a shared city. That man is bound, doubtlessly, for one of the waterfront taverns that serve as gathering places for the most dubious characters, morally bankrupt tosspots and societal scourges. People with whom the harbor master would never think of associating. He shakes his head, irritation in the stranger's snubs still gnawing at him. Yet another drunk who will end up with the rest of them. A waste of life. The tavern is a low brick building on the corner of two streets that must form the nexus of the city's stink. A powerful mixture of dead fish, low tide, and human, canine, and feline effluvia. Painted on the brick, illuminated by a single intact streetlight, is a familiar symbol, the ornate twist that remained visible on the paper in his pocket. S. This is it, he thinks. He may not know what the symbol means, but its reappearance makes a kind of sense. This is where he's supposed to be. What begins at the water shall end there, and what the voice tells him, and what ends there shall once more begin. Inside, the tavern keeper sniffs an empty glass, his long mustache trailing over the rim. His face pinches, as if the smell brings back an unpleasant memory. A dozen blind drunk rascals are calling his name, shouting and beating their own empty glasses on the bar. So the tavern keeper takes note of the wet man in the overcoat only long enough to snap up his money, fill the offending glass, and thump it down on the bar in front of him. This establishment sees its fair share of waterlogged men. Twice a night, some sailor stags out to the harbor, falls in, comes back in for another drink to warm up. Twice a day, some poor bugger is flung from his ship into the shallows and swims in to seek a drink, a whore, a new employer, almost certainly in that order. The man in the wet overcoat turns away, drink in hand, and the bartender forgets him immediately, turning to serve the next needy son of a bitch. The man in the overcoat finds an opening on the wooden bench that runs the length of the room, and he settles himself down with the weary sigh of a man who believes himself to be at the end of a long journey. He glances around the room at the stumbling, shouting, laughing, backslapping, cursing, and shoving groups of sailors, and at the solitary patrons like this curly-haired man with a waist-length orange beard who for some reason is carrying a claw hammer and twirling it idly. And that man there, sallow and heavy-lidded and dressed in mortician's black. And that man, wearing a brown duster, sitting on a bar stool, scanning the crowd and jotting occasionally in a notebook. Are these his people, these malcontents, these assemblage of the strange and suspicious? Is he in his homeland? The coin he handed over for his glass of beer was foreign to him, but then perhaps he simply has no memory of his native currency. At a table along the far wall sits a young woman of no more than 20 alone. She is reading a book, a large volume, as thick as Don Quixote. Teehee, I have no clue how to say that. And the light from a sconce on the wall behind her, as if this chaotic, drunken hovel were a library. She reads with one elbow on the table, her thumb cradling her chin, one finger rustling thoughtfully over her lips. Her olive complexion and black hair, which is pulled back and tied into a long braid that hangs nearly to her waist, suggests that she hails from a part of the world where the sun shines more warmly and more often than it does in this city, which has the feel of the gray northern latitudes. Odd that she is here by herself. There are only a handful of other women about, all of them with commerce on the mind, winding through the groups of sailors seeking trade. Odder still that none of these men, roaring with uncorked courage, is foisting his attentions upon the bookish young one. She appears to enjoy her public solitude. There is an easy grace in her square-shouldered posture, and the neatness of her attire, a finely tailored dress of emerald green, and the unhurried manner with which she turns a page, and the way she lays a finger over her lips and stared off, right through the commotion, presumably contemplating a line she just read. Comfortable alone and easily overlooked. A kindred spirit? Perhaps, if not kindred to the man he is or was, then to the sort of man he wouldn't mind being. He wonders, then, what he looks like to others. They might assume that he is waiting for something or someone, but is not sure what or who that might be. Or that he is an informer for the police or for a ship's captain. Or maybe he is simply just a lonely traveler. He sips his drink. He hunches forward on the bench. He watches as the drops of water fall from him onto the uneven floor and wend along in a rivulet, snaking over and around and between the warped boards. He steals unanswered glances at the young woman now and again. He watches the door, lets his gaze drift across the crowd, waits, hopes to be recognized. He must have some history in this establishment, or some other purpose for being here. The symbol must mean something. His intuition must have a basis. A sailor with a freshly split lip and a bloody chin slashes by and bumps knees with the man in the overcoat. The sailor stops, looking flummoxed that something solid has impeded his progress, and gradually his bloodshot eyes focus on the man, who braces himself for an insult, a threat, or a fist. Instead, the sailor wobbles there, shifting his weight erratically from one foot to the other. "You're," the sailor says, searching for words. "What?" "You're bleeding," the man in the overcoat replies. It takes a moment for the sailor to understand the words. Perhaps the man in the overcoat has an accent quite foreign to the sailor's ear. Finally, the sailor nods. "It's the truth," he slurs. He pushes himself away from the man and staggers down a narrow channel of open space, listening hard to port, then thrust himself into a circle of seamen, all of them clad in filthy canvas doublets, all of them showing the marks of violence upon their faces. They will spend the next hours speculating in half-sentences about the origin and purpose of the hulking ship at the harbor's edge, and about the wages the owner of such a foul vessel might be willing to pay to coax a crew on board. The man in the overcoat will not be a subject, much less a part of their conversation. The sailor forgot about him immediately. The man stares into his glass, sighs, contemplates. How did he become so wet? Why does his body ache, especially his right knee and hip? The entire right side of his body, in fact, feels deeply bruised. There is a raw, burning sensation behind his right ear, and now that he's become dry, he recognizes a feeling of stickiness down his back. Did he fall from a significant height? Perhaps he is simply engrossed in the catalog of his injuries, or perhaps he has grown too complacent with being overlooked. Such gifts do not last forever, of course. But he is slow to notice that the young woman is now regarding him from across the room. Her look might be one of recognition, but it might not. His intuition tells him nothing. Still, every other part of him agrees that it would be shrewd to investigate further. He stops several steps from her table and gestures towards the empty chair opposite her. Might I ask if you're waiting for someone? It depends on what you mean, the young woman says. Her voice surprises him. It sounds as if it belongs to a much older woman. I mean, here, now, this evening. Are you expecting someone to join you? I thought you might. May I sit? You're awfully wet. I know, he says. It appears to be my most salient characteristic. Surely there's more to you than that. You must be someone when you're dry. I can't remember the last time I was dry. Why don't you take off your coat? I would prefer not to, he says. He hopes she won't ask why. He doesn't have a reason, just a fear. Perhaps you're the sort of person who has to leave places quickly, she offers. He is unsure how much to reveal about his state of being, physical, mnemonic, philosophical, or otherwise. I find myself currently in uncertain circumstances, he says. Tell me, have we met? She sighs. That's a tired line, and one that usually serves as a prelude to an equally tedious proposition. She closes her book and sets it on the table. The embossed lettering on the cover is flaking away, but he can still make out the title and the author. The Archer's Tale, by Archimedes de Sobrero. Neither is familiar to him. Do you live here, in the city? I'm traveling, she says. I travel frequently. I arrived on the liner, the Imperia. Do you always travel with such cumbersome books? I don't trust anyone who wouldn't. He purses his lips and nods. So, I trust you know the name of this city. She tilts her head and regards him slantwise. Then she laughs. You're making sport of me. What's your game? I'm curious, he says, as to whether you know who I am. Are you someone I should know? Probably not, he says. I can't say for certain. The look she gives him invites further explanation, and he decides, though it's more of an impulse than decision, to offer the closest thing he knows to the truth. Something happened to my memory, he says, and he waits, tensed, for her response. She reaches for her drink, a vein of dark liquid in a tall, narrow glass, and sips thoughtfully. Something about her in this moment strikes him as being familiar. The motion of her arm, the shape of her hand, the wrinkle of her upper lip? He does not know. Nor does he have any way to tell whether he is sensing a fragment of memory, a fragment of the idea of a memory, or something his mind, desperate for connections, has created on its own. In an agonizingly long wait before she returns the glass to the table, she blots her lips dry with the corner of her handkerchief. You should be very careful whom you tell that to, she says, indicating the entire room. Or perhaps the world, with a sweep of her eyes. Many people would take advantage. Undoubtedly. Do you know your name? Where you live? No. Do you have anything in your pockets? Anything that might... He thinks about the wet mash of paper in his overcoat pocket, but decides not to show it to her just yet. Not until he discovers what the symbol means, or what else used to be written on that page. Or, for that matter, who she is. He shakes his head. Ah, she says with a playful smirk. You do have something. What is it? This sends an unease creeping through him, her knowing or sensing his thoughts, and he finds himself searching for a way to shift the conversation smoothly, searching so intently that he fails to register the piercing squeak of the tavern door opening, fails to notice the heavy footsteps making their way toward them over the warped floorboards. You haven't given me your name, he is about to say, when he notices a change in the young woman's expression. Her eyes widen slightly, her mouth reshaping itself from that of a smirk into a tense pinch. Tense pinch. Tense pinch. That's funny. You haven't given me your name, he's about to say, when he notices a change in the young woman's expression. Her eyes widen slightly, her mouth reshaping itself from that of a smirk to a tense pinch. What is this look? Disapproval? Resignation? Surprise doesn't seem to be a part of it. What? He asks, just as a filthy handkerchief is clamped over his face from behind. He struggles, but the grip that holds him is like iron. He tries not to inhale for a moment, and then two. But of course he cannot stop himself, and his vision begins to shimmer and blur as a smell, sweet but scorched, fills his head, reminding him of the holiday cakes he enjoyed as a child. Panicked, he inhales again, involuntarily, and all the sounds around him turn into a metallic and indistinct blur. In the center of this cloud is her voice, saying words that sound as if they're in a language he does not know. But the warp of the air and the twisting, bending room strips these words of inflection so that he cannot understand the words, or what she means, or even to whom she is speaking. Another voice, male, answers her in a grunted, bilabial reply. Then, as the last ember of his consciousness is extinguishing itself in this dark corner of this dark bar on this dark night in this dark city, he glimpses the larger man's face and is struck by its familiarity. It resembles a face that his mind pictures as his own, only with scars running down the center of his forehead and diverging wildly just above his brow, a river delta of scar tissue. Not a twin, not necessarily a brotherly resemblance, more like that of a cousin whom life has treated most cruelly, and who has learned cruelty in return. Or perhaps it's just all a trick of the fumes. He would scream if he had any control over his mouth. No one remarks upon the man in the dark overcoat as he leaves the bar, even though he's being carried over another man's shoulder, limp as a sack of beets. Just another traveler, overcome by drink, not worthy of a shout or even a cynical chuckle. Gazes, as we have seen, wash over him and roll away. Outside, the shock of the cold and driving rain pounds one last flicker of awareness into the man in the overcoat. He opens his eyes just as a monkey wearing shreds of velveteen darts across the street, trailing a rope that slaps softly over the street stones. He hears curses and heavy breathing and sees two brutish men chasing the creature. His final thought, before the world turns a flat and absolute black, is run, monkey, run. Motion. His mind doesn't sense it, but his body does. It is yanked and tugged, a piece of unwieldy freight. It bounces along with the cadence of someone else's footsteps. It is hoisted, swung, dropped, dragged, and dropped again. Rest. Then, slowly building from the stillness, a gestational rock and bounce. Fluid transverse and longitudinal sways. Gradually, his consciousness returns, presses against the walls of its dark, pinhole-sized cell, expanding, and his other senses resume to function. A curious dankness in the air, a wash of sound, a baritone sweep of tidal spirants, a percussive roll of wind-snapped linen, a mezzo-soprano note of creaking wood, all of which lets him know before he opens his eyes that he is at sea, that he has been stolen from land and deposited on water. What begins at the water? He is in a hammock that smells as if it's been marinating for decades in saltwater stink. His overcoat, dry now, is spread over him like a blanket. He blinks once, twice, then rubs his eyes. He is in a small, dim cabin that is the length of a 9-pin lane and just wide enough to accommodate the hammock that has been tied to both walls. At the far end, a ladder leads up to an open hatch that admits a rectangle of deep orange sunlight. He has a terrible headache and feels feverish and slow. That sweet scorched smell still haunts his nostrils. Only now it reminds him not of the holidays he enjoyed as a child, but of the ones he will never enjoy again, now that he does not know who he is or where, if anywhere, is home. He eases himself from the sling. His legs wobble like a newborn fawn's, then wraps the overcoat around himself to fight off the chill. He has just stepped onto the first rung of the ladder when he notices the knife cuts wounding the dark wood of the bulkhead, just above where his head was when he was in the hammock. A crude, jagged version of the same S symbol he saw outside the bar and on that paper. This time, though, he understands its meaning much differently. This place, it seems to say, is the last place you ought to be. At the top of the ladder, he peeks out cautiously. The hatch opens directly onto the forecastle, which strikes him as odd. His cabin, apparently, is unconnected to any other part of the ship, as if it is used for quarantine or as a brig. But if he is a prisoner, why would the hatch be open? The ship itself is an archaic-looking vessel. He recognizes it as a Xebec design, sleek and shallow drafting. A three-master favored by the pirates of previous centuries, but an anachronism on the modern seas. And it is improbable looking as well, in a state midway between decrepitude and tidy renovation, albeit renovation performed by a shipwright working against reason. The deck is freshly replanked in some places, while in others the wood has rotted away, leaving holes big enough to catch and break a sailor's ankle, if not swallow him whole. Two of the three lateen sails look fresh from the nearest sail loft, while the third is torn and frayed, a discolored banner of neglect flying from a mizzenmast, whose top third appears blackened, as if by a lightning strike. A revelation. He is someone who knows at least a few things about ships. He counts 19 crewmen on the main deck and the quarterdeck, none of whom is moving with the urgency he associates with even the most undisciplined and resentful crews. Instead, they trudge from task to task, grim and ox-like, somehow keeping the ship afloat and smoothly on the move. He cannot see their downcast faces clearly, but their varied skin tones and builds suggest a heterogeneous crew drawn from all corners of the globe. He watches them for a long time, his ears full of the rushing wind, catching the sails and slapping at the rigging, of the churn and the wash of the waves and their watery smacks against the wooden hull, before he realizes how strangely quiet the crew is. There are no shouts of command, there is none of the rough repartee of the briny, there are no grunts or cries or complaints. Somewhere overhead, a few birds call out, but the crew is as silent as the dead. He assumes he is to join them. After all, isn't that why people are shanghaied? For labor they would not give voluntarily? He is in no hurry to start, though, unsure of his surroundings and drowning in a sense of threat, still woozy from the chloroform, and with what he can tell are a landman's unsteady legs and stomach. Dark clouds map the sky, their edges illuminated by the orange sun, streaky and low on the horizon. Has he slept through an entire day? At first, this surprises him, but he slowly realizes that he feels as if he has been unconscious for far longer than that. Until now, he has felt fairly calm, at the very least, calm for someone who has been abducted by unknown persons for unknown purposes. But the sense that large swaths of time have gone by, time in which the world may have shifted in some fundamental way without his noticing, makes his skin crawl. He can feel dread weighing on the insides. His stomach feels as dense as mercury. He looks at the sun and thinks, setting, to starboard, which means we're heading south. He exhales. What a relief to know one thing, however vague, about one's direction. A burst of reedy, high-pitched trills, those seabirds, he thinks, looking up, though he still doesn't see them, snaps him back to the moment. He scans the ship and the water, thinking of escape. No land in sight, no ships to signal. In one corner of the main deck is a tarp covering what might be a dinghy, but he'd never be able to launch it himself. His only option, it seems, is to hurl himself into the waves and put his faith in water. And something in the back of his mind tells him that he's tried something like that before without success. He shivers in a gust of cold wind and hugs the overcoat around himself more tightly. Then, a scratchy voice comes to his ears. At first it startles him because he thought those voices belonged to the old quarter, but then he realizes that the sound is coming from the main deck below him. He ducks, hopes that he's escaped notice, but the voice continues. It's more of a wax cylinder hiss than a voice, really, but it is there on the ship and real, and it repeats a word over and over as it approaches him. S, the voice says. It is not a word that means anything to him. He hears feet climbing the rungs up to the forecastle. You, he hears. S. There will be no hiding. And so he arranges himself into a stolid posture, standing tall on the forecastle to face what is coming his way. The owner of the voice is a behemoth of a man, clad neck to shin in sailor's Osnaburg. One arm of the shirt is full of sags and rips and is discolored in 100 tones of browns and black. The other is a perfect shade of bone, with a ring of pristine white stitches attaching it at the shoulder. A quick glance aft shows the rest of the crew is also dressed to varying degrees in such nautical motley. The sailor's head is bald and sun-blistered. His beard is a maelstrom of black hair. He does not appear to be wearing a sidearm, but this does not leave the man in the overcoat feeling any more secure about his current situation or his future prospects. Me? You. S. That's my name? The sailor nods. S. He runs the name through his mind and over his tongue. It continues to mean nothing to him. Just a word. Still, he feels calmer suddenly. It is much better to have a name than not to have one. He knows 2 facts now. I am on a ship heading south. My name at the moment is S. The sailor says something like beggars or bears, but S can't hear it clearly as it is masked by the rushing breeze. There is more important information to be gathered anyway. What's the name of your vessel? S asks. Mine, the sailor says. What's the name of this vessel? The name. His voice is surprisingly insubstantial, more noticed than heard. No name? Done once, haps. Done no more. What's your name? Ridden of mine, the big man says. He nods toward the shuffling crew to the aft of the ship. They ridden a tharn. Name's is trouble. And yet I have one, apparently. The big man smiles. His teeth are rounded like little yellow tombstones set irregularly into gums the color of earth. Trouble, he says. His accent is a strange thing. It seems not to issue from a specific place, but is instead ladled up from a transoceanic stew of dictations and impediments. Why was I brought here? S asks. What's the man with the scar? Or where's the man with the scar? He traces a line down the center of his forehead, then jerks his hand away, disconcerted to find that the skin there feels raw and tingly. A chill slowly descends his spine. We've struck, the sailor says, to take you. What do you mean, take me? Take you. Take me where? Nowhere. I need to speak to the captain. Where's the captain? Ain't no captain. How can there be no captain? Ain't no captain. Sus. We viv the ship. He pauses. Do what's needed. The big sailor seems calm, but the wrongness of him, of his silent comrades, of this crazy quilt of a ship, and of S.'s own presence on it, sends a stab of panic through him. He feels his heart thudding faster, feels his spine turning to ice. He, this alleged S, has no control over who or where or why he is. He feels as if he is falling again, falling through the dark, with nothing to believe in but the cruel efficiency of gravity. His knees buckle, and he collapses to the deck. The wood feels damp and cool on his cheek, and it offers a sort of relief. He hears the big man whistle sharply, hears many sets of feet crossing the deck toward them, feels himself tugged back up to standing, and supported on the shoulder of another sailor. When he scans the lineup of faces in front of him, while the big man addresses them in a scratchy, eerily insubstantial voice, and he notices something odd, except for the big man. All of the sailors have dark blemishes around their mouth. He is still trying to understand what sort of dietary deficiency or tobacco habit might account for this when the crewman holding him up turns to face him. He's so close their noses nearly touch, and S sees thin, dark threads crisscrossing his lips and ending in a tiny knot at one corner. Tiny pink spots mark where the stitches enter and exit the skin. S gasps audibly, and the shipman's lips stretch wide to the side, straining the threads and turning the pink spots blood red. And S finds himself wishing that he could unwind time so that he could live his life without ever seeing up close what passes for a smile on this nameless, monstrous vessel.